joined by Rabbi David Mason, Director of the Jewish Council of Racial Equality, JCORE, which is a partner of the Jewish International Humanitarian Organization, HIAS. Rabbi David Mason, thank you so much for joining me. There's a lot of fear in Jewish communities. You know, I represent the Stamford Hill area of London, in part, a lot of Orthodox Jewish community in South Tottenham and Stamford Hill area. And there's a real sort of trauma and fear. People talk of pogroms. The nature of the attack on Jewish people, and the Jewish community, I think globally, is about 9 million people. It's a small community. So but how do we hang together as Londoners, as people in the UK, from whatever community that we come from? You do a lot of work across faith. How do we come together at this time?
Yeah, thanks, David. Thank you for having me on. And you're right. You know, we've seen a 494% rise, according to the CST, the Community Security Trust, over the last week. That's a massive rise in anti-Semitism. People are worried about traveling. My kids go to Jewish schools and they've been told to cover their uniform. And, you know, the skull cap that Jewish boys wear a baseball cap so that you're covering that. And that's unheard of. I mean, in my life, the connections to the Holocaust that we are making in the sort of stories that have come out of the massacres in the south of Israel are really quite traumatizing in communities across. So, yeah, it is really, really difficult. It's really vulnerable. But we cannot lose some of the great interfaith work that's been done. And I think faith leaders really have a responsibility across the community to step up. It's important to bring faith leaders together. I would say to anyone listening, I would like to myself bring faith leaders together so that we call out, number one, anti-Semitism, that we're clear and unequivocal about anti-Semitism. Often there's a fear of, are we going to upset people by what we say in terms of the conflict? But we don't want to bring the conflict to exacerbate any difficulties in our country. We have a really good record of cohesion. And I would say that it goes exactly the same for Islamophobia, that we as a Jewish community also stand up with the Muslim community and see and hear the isolation you talk about. It's tricky, these discussions over the politics, but we want a community where we get on. I think language matters, and I think we need big tent, brave language, David. Brave language where I understand the differences with the other over the politics. But I'm able to also be sensitive about the pain the other is going through. And I know across the community...
Help me with that big tent. I'm looking at some of the text messages, some of the things that people are tweeting in response to what others have said, in response to what I've said. And there's a lack of sensitivity. It's quite extraordinary how nasty and how... what's the word? How it gets quite nasty quite quickly, this subject. A lot of people listening, frankly, will run a mile from this subject because it gets so nasty so quickly.
I think, there's two things here I'd say. Is on the one hand, for many Jewish people, there is the fear that others will never... in a sense, will think that everything Israel does is bad. Almost conspiratorial sense that whatever Israel does, is itself problematic, is bad. And that even though what's going on is painful for all people in the Middle East and for Israel and Palestine, that is difficult. But you're right. I think we need to, in a sense, emphasize the humanitarian urge now. I spoke in a synagogue yesterday where I was saying how shocked we were as a community. But I was also able to say that we can feel for Palestinians in Gaza not caught up in the conflict who are being killed.
I mean, it says in the Torah, doesn't it, that human life is blessed.
Yeah.
Whoever has that human life. So it is not the case that one life is better or more important than another's.
Absolutely. We're all created in the image of God. As I said, we read it yesterday. It was actually the portion we read yesterday, the beginning of creation, where we're all created in the image of God. I think in the short period of time after the atrocities by Hamas, it almost, especially for the Jewish community, it's almost trying to come out of the mourning and the shock to that reality. And we need to give everyone time to come out into that reality. But leaders, and not just political leaders have done well, I must say, in this stage, but in civil society, we need a sense of solidarity, of love for the other, of a humanitarian urge, understanding the pain of the other, but wanting to bring people together at the same time.
And tell me, there will be protest. The wound of the occupation of the Palestinian people is a deep one. The failure to arrive at a two-state solution and peace is a deep one. So there will be protests of people trying to speak up for the Palestinians. Now, there will be people within that glorify hate, that glorify terrorism, that use the language of Hamas, which is effectively driving Israel into the sea. How do we strike that balance at this time of the important democratic right to process and make your voice known, but also not glorifying terrorism or hate?
I think there is a position, Sundar Katwala, the head of British Future, wrote about this, and I think you yourself reflected it at Labour conference this week, actually, of being pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian. We've got to be able to separate out what Hamas have done. I think Hamas, you could substitute almost for ISIS in what they did in the south of Israel, in their tactics. And we must be able to separate out the pain and anguish of what Hamas have done as terrorism from the belief that Palestinians deserve self-determination, they have an identity, and they deserve a future. It's hard at the moment, obviously, seeing through what has happened. But we need to be able to come out and say there is a real importance for Israel to have security, to flourish, to be part of a flourishing Middle East, with a Palestinian entity that also can contribute to that future. And if we can take out, in a sense, and be clear also about our eschewing, about our detestation of what Hamas has done, that they don't deserve to be part of that future, I think that offers maybe a way forward, David.
Rabbi David Mason, Director of the Jewish Council for Racial Equality, thank you so much for joining me. I'm now joined by Zara Mohammed.